Hello and welcome to Mindful Latter-day Saint Christian Living and Apologetics. I'm your host, Timothy Berman, here to inspire you, encourage you, and edify you as we all are pressing forward with steadfast faith through Jesus Christ, because it is He that lives through us, not that we live according to our own will and purpose. I am doing a 36-episode study on apostasy to restoration, and this series is titled Apostasy to Restoration, Reformation or Restoration, that is the question. And we are in the third lesson. It stems from the 1960 Melchizedek Priesthood Study Manual, Apostasy to Restoration. I have updated the content with additional peer-reviewed scholarly research into the subject matter to give it some depth and breadth. And the document, PDF document, will be available for download in the show notes and description of the YouTube video, as well as you can access this for free by signing up for a free account over at the Patreon for this as well. And so I've already gotten wind of somebody who attempted to take apart the second episode, not realizing that this is a 36 episode study of the subject matter, because there's a lot of information, folks, and a lot of information I'm learning as well. And so I want to give diligence to this and give this room for you to take hold of and study it out and reason it out in your own minds and your own understanding, because this is important. As Latter-day Saints, we believe that there was an apostasy of the early church, and it's important for us to understand this foundational claim because everything rests upon it. And so let's go ahead and get into this, because in the previous lesson, I explored how Christianity emerged in a religiously pluralistic world, a world saturated with mystery cults, hero-redeemer myths, and philosophical schools. These traditions offered sacred meals, priesthoods, promises of immortality, and initiatory rites. Yet Christianity distinguished itself not through ritual imitation, but through historical testimony. It proclaimed a real incarnate Savior, Jesus of Nazareth, whose resurrection was witnessed and recorded. This was not myth, but mere memory, not symbol, but substance. As the gospel spread across the Mediterranean, it encountered not only spiritual competition, it also encountered political resistance. Christianity's exclusivity, its refusal to worship the emperor or participate in civic sacrifices, was seen as subversive. The Roman state, which tied religion to public loyalty, viewed Christians as dangerous atheists and dissidents. What began as a movement of peace and proclamation soon became the target of suspicion, denunciation, and persecution. Now, Jesus warned the disciples that persecution was going to be inevitable. We read this in John 15:18-20. Paul himself warned his disciple Timothy and iterated how all who live godly lives centered on Christ will face persecution. And we find that in 2 Timothy 3:12. Yet despite these pressures, Christianity grew. It endured martyrdom. It endured personal property confiscation and slander. It spread from Judea to Gaul, from Egypt to Britain. And by the 3rd century, it had become too widespread to ignore. The empire, which once sought to extinguish it, began to tolerate it. Then Christianity became favored within the Roman Empire. And then through funding, political funding, and support, the Christianity grew into a position under Constantine and Theodosius where they proclaimed it as the sole religion of the state. And this triumph came at a cost. As Christianity gained legal status, imperial patronage, and political power, it also began to compromise. The persecuted church became the persecuting church. The gospel of love was entangled with corrosion. Bishops became bureaucrats, temples became churches, and the purity of primitive faith was diluted by the machinery of the Roman Empire. And so, like I said, download the PDF document in the show notes and description, because it has all the citations, it has all the footnotes annotated, as well as additional references and a couple of appendixes. And so you'll find all this information in there, and it's good for you to download and have that available. And like I said, our goal here, my goal here, An objective in this lesson is to trace his transformation from illicit sect to imperial religion. And as we examine how the church's rise to prominence sowed the seeds of apostasy. And I want to situate this historical arc within the broader narrative of the Restoration. For if the church lost its way in the corridors of Roman power, then divine intervention was not only possible, it was necessary. And so here's the objective for today's lesson. We're going to trace the transformation of Christianity in the Roman Empire from a persecuted and illicit sect to the sole state religion, examining the political, legal, and theological shifts that enabled this ascent. Next, we're going to look at a brief analysis of the civic religious philosophy of Rome, including the role of the Pontifex Maximus, the imperial cults, and the public obligation in order to understand the reason Christianity was initially suppressed and later embraced. We're going to evaluate the consequences of imperial favor, showing how Christianity's legalization and elevation led to compromise, politicization, and eventual apostasy from the primitive gospel. This means that we're going to situate this historical trajectory within the Restoration narrative because it is demonstrating the reason divine intervention was necessary to recover the original purity, authority, and covenantal structure of Christ's church. Again, this is the third episode of a 36 episode of this conversation that I'm going to have with you. Now, as we move into this lesson, I want you to consider how the earliest Christians related to the Roman state. At first, the missionaries of the Christian cause subordinated everything to their religious assignment. Jesus had commanded them to go into all the world and teach all nations, and despite Jewish opposition, they prospered in their mission. By the time Paul entered the scene, Christians were able to travel across the empire with relative safety. This was largely due to the peace and stability Rome had established within the Mediterranean world. Paul himself, though occasionally arrested, often secured release by appealing to his Roman citizenship. And in Romans 13, he even declared that magistrates were servants of God, bringing law and order to society, which is Romans 13, 1 through 2. However, this period of relative peace did not last. Within a few decades, Roman officials began to view Christianity differently. Sporadic persecutions arose, and eventually the state concluded that extermination of the faith was necessary. The reason? Because of Rome's unique religious philosophy. Religion was seen as a public obligation. So Roman religion was inseparable from politics. Sacrifices and festivals were civic duties meant to secure divine favor for the empire. Christians' refusal to participate was seen as endangering Rome's stability. And then you have the imperial cult as a loyalty test. The emperor was venerated as part of the state cult. Refusing to sacrifice to him was tantamount to rejecting Roman authority. This explains why Theodosius' decree in 249 CE required all citizens to sacrifice, inaugurating the first empire-wide persecution. There is the legal and social suspicion as well. Roman law suppressed unauthorized or private cults. Christianity, with its exclusive worship and rejection of syncretism, was treated as politically dangerous. And then there's the popular hostility. Beyond official decrees, ordinary pagans denounced Christians. The accusations of atheism, cannibalism, and immorality fueled suspicion. Trials often began with local denunciations rather than imperial initiative. As Pliny the Younger reported to Emperor Trajan in his letter, being one of the earliest pagan testimonies about Christian refusal to participate in civic religion, he noted that true Christians could not be forced to sacrifice to idols or curse Christ. Those who complied with pagan ritual were released. Those who refused were condemned. This refusal earned Christians the label of atheists, not in our modern sense of understanding of disbelief in all gods. It was a specific charge of impiety and rejection of Rome's civic deities. Christian apologists like Athenagoras and Minucius Felix responded by framing the accusations. Yes, Christians rejected pagan gods because they worshiped the one true God, pure and righteous. So the clash between church and state was not simply political. It was theological. Rome demanded conformity to preserve civic unity. Christianity demanded exclusivity to preserve fidelity to Christ. This tension defined the early centuries of the faith and set the stage for both persecution and eventual transformation, as we see in Acts 5:29. And so when we look at this, when we come to understand this, here's the historical context that we need to come to terms with. When we talk about the changing world of Christianity in the Roman Empire, we need to begin with how Romans themselves understood religion. The Roman worldview saw religion not as a private matter. Roman religion was inseparable from civic duty. To honor God, the gods, was to honor the empire itself. Sacrifices were not optional rituals. They were acts that maintained what the Romans called the pactiorum, or the peace of the gods. This peace was believed to guarantee prosperity, stability, and victory in war. So when someone refused to sacrifice, it wasn't seen as a personal choice. It was seen as undermining the very foundation of Roman society. This is where Christians came into sharp conflict with Roman expectations. Pagan observers often accused Christians of being atheists. Now, this may sound strange to us because Christians were deeply religious. However, from the Roman perspective of this time period, of this historical understanding, rejecting the pantheon of gods and refusing to participate in sacrifices looked like irreligion. To them, it was a denial of the divine order that sustained the empire. And so atheists became a common label thrown at Christians in the 2nd century, especially in polemical writings meant to discredit them. We see this accusation clearly in the works of Athenagoras of Athens, a Christian apologist writing around 177 CE. He composed a text called A Plea for the Christians, in which he defended believers against charges of atheism, cannibalism, and immorality. The very fact that he had to write such a defense shows how widespread these accusations were. Christians were not only misunderstood, they were actively maligned as dangerous outsiders. Roman officials themselves sometimes echoed these concerns, even if they didn't use the word atheist. Take Pliny the Younger, for example. In his famous letters to Emperor Trajan, he describes interrogating Christians. He notes that they refused to sacrifice to the gods or to the emperor's image. For Pliny, this refusal was the heart of the problem. It wasn't about abstract theology. It was about loyalty to Rome. To refuse sacrifice was to refuse allegiance, and that made Christians suspect. Another vivid example comes from Minucius Felix's dialogue, Octavius, written in the late 2nd century. In this text, the pagan speaker Caecilius accuses Christians of being irreligious and atheistic because they reject the gods. The Christian speaker Octavius responds by affirming monotheism and rejecting idolatry. What's fascinating here is a clash of perspectives. For Caecilius, rejecting the gods meant rejecting the very fabric of society. For Octavius, rejecting idols was the only way to worship the one true God. This dialogue captures the tension at the heart of the Roman Christian encounter. Two worldviews colliding, each convinced the other was undermining truth. So when we look at the historical context, we see that the charge of atheism wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a serious accusation with civic and political weight. Romans feared that Christians, by refusing sacrifice, threatened the empire's prosperity and stability. Christians, on the other hand, saw themselves as faithful witnesses to the one God, willing to endure slander and persecution, rather than compromise their convictions. This tension shaped the way Christianity developed in its earliest centuries, forcing believers to articulate their faith in contrast to Roman expectations and to defend themselves against charges that struck at the heart of their identity. And so, here's a quote. They despise the temples as dead houses. They reject the gods. They laugh at sacred things. Poor wretches. They have no altars, no temples, no images. Therefore, they are all alike, without religion, without worship. And the cameo is blocking the rest of that. However, this quote comes from Minucius Felix Octavius, translated by Robertson Donaldson in Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 4, published in 1885 through the Christian Literature Publishing Company. In this apologetic dialogue, the pagan speaker Caecilius accuses Christians of atheism, irreligion, and immorality because they reject Roman temples and gods. The text preserves a vivid example of how Roman society viewed Christian exclusivity as dangerous impiety. And with that, we come to the most interesting aspect of this, the Pontifex Maximus. Because within Roman government, there existed a religious bureau that might be compared to a department of the executive division of a government, or a cabinet post. Its head was, in reality, the secretary of minister of religion. Just as there were other secretaries or ministers in charge of the army, finances, foreign relations, and other departments, this person was designated with the title Pontifex Maximus, which indicated that he was the highest or chief priest of the Roman government. It was his duty to regulate the numerous pagan religions within the empire and see that there was no friction among them. He was also responsible for the regulation of worship and the proper maintenance of the various shrines and temples connected with the Roman religions. The office also carried immense political weight. By controlling the calendar, the Pontifex Maximus determined the timing of festivals, elections, and even military campaigns. He was custodian of the pontifical books, a collection of accumulated records, rituals, and precedents that guided the College of Pontifices in their decisions. These texts served as the institutional memory of Roman religion, ensuring continuity and consistency across generations. And then enter Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar was elected as Pontifex Maximus in 63 BCE, he gained not only religious authority, he also gained a powerful political platform. This role allowed him to shape public life, reinforce his legitimacy, and intertwine his personal ambitions with Rome's secret traditions. Unlike later Christian clergy, pontifices received no formal theological training. Their expertise was practical, rooted in precedent and ritual rather than doctrine. Yet their access to the pontifical books and their participation in the college gave them a unique influence over Roman society, blending religion, politics, and law into a single sphere of authority. Thus, the office of Pontifex Maximus was far more than a priestly title. It was a cornerstone of Roman governance, a fusion of sacred duty and political power that reflected the Roman conviction that the favor of the gods was inseparable from the success of the state. And so we see that Julius Caesar being Pontifex Maximus in 63 BCE. Now, the religious philosophy of the Roman Empire, or the Roman state, or the Roman Republic, however you want to refer to it, did not deny the existence of any religion's gods, nor did it purport to declare that there was but one true religion, nor did it take the position that there was one religion that was better for the Roman Empire than another. In one sense, there was religious toleration that bordered on almost pure religious liberty. The proper regulation of the many cults provided sufficient types of religious devotions to satisfy the religious needs of most people within the various far-flung portions of the sprawling empire. And so, speaking of this situation, Edward Gibbon, the famous historian, wrote the various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful. And this toleration produced not only mutual indulgence, but of even religious concord. And this is Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 1, Chapter 11, edited by David Wormsley, Penguin Classics, 1996, and it's pages 367 to 412. And so it was into this religious world that Christianity ventured, struggled to gain converts, and save all mankind. And so you see this here, the classic antiquity Roman religious piety there, and Roman religion centered on fides, mutual trust between gods and humans, and pax dorium, or the peace of the gods. Rituals were performed to maintain divine favor, ensuring prosperity and stability for the Roman state. Religion was civic, not personal, and deeply tied to patriotic duty. Romans emphasized correct ritual over belief. There was no formal creed. If one performed the rites properly, personal thoughts about the gods were irrelevant. Emotion was discouraged in worship, and religious acts were governed by jus divinum, divine law prescribing ritual behavior. And then the functional deities within early Roman religion featured religious atomism, a vast array of functional deities tied to specific acts of phenomena like childbirth or doorways. Knowing a deity's exact name was crucial for invoking power. Romans often added phrases like, or whatever name you wish to be called, to cover unknown deities. There was sacrifice and magic, where sacrifice was seen as nourishing divine forces, enabling them to act on behalf of worshippers. Magic and taboo practices such as avoiding lightning, struck places, or newborns were widespread. Even official rites retained magical elements like the Lupercali festival and Mars ritual dances by the Sali. And then the Etruscan influence, where Rome's religious structure was shaped by the Etruscan rule, 575 to 100 BCE. The Etruscans emphasized ritual precision and divination, linking heaven and earth in a unified system. They introduced temple architecture, priestly roles, and calendar reforms that became foundational to Roman religious life. And so, the followers of Jesus, people of the way, whether they were Jews or Christians, or Jews or Gentiles, these followers of Christ, however, soon learned that they were working at a disadvantage within this worldview, and this worldview of government-sponsored religions. First, Christianity had no status. It was something that had not grown up within the formation of the empire, and hence had not acquired any official recognition. Christianity had not placed itself under the direction of the Pontifex Maximus, and hence was without the protection of this officer, where the officer was obliged to exercise on behalf of the cults that had official standing. Secondly, the scriptures containing the Old Testament and admitted membership to Jews made early Christianity appear in the eyes of the unthinking people to be nothing more than an offshoot from Judaism or another sect of the Jews. Throughout the empire, from time to time, the Jews had suffered severe persecutions, despoliation of their property, and occasional banishments from certain towns. Christians, because of their common religious heritage with the Jews, were for this reason often persecuted along with the Jews. The Roman attitude was that any religion that could not or had not been accepted as one of the state religions had no right to exist. It was denied the right to hold property, construct buildings, or hold public or private services for worship. Christianity, as it spread into the cities of the empire, was a religious organization which stood outside the protection of Roman law. Furthermore, it had no redress against other religious groups that might attack it or destroy its gathering places. In short, Christianity had no legal right to exist within the empire. The first 3 centuries of the Christian era found the church in this unenviable position of an illicit religion, and its leaders sought relief from such a situation in various ways. The record of the 10 major persecutions that were planned and executed by the Roman government between the close of the 1st century and the first quarter of the 4th century shows that the state tried to destroy what it deemed to be a dangerous cult. The resistance of the Christians to these persecutions, in which they suffered loss of property, freedom, and sometimes life, is a story of great faith and devotion, as they attempted to persuade the governing officials to investigate their claims and accord them status as a legal religion. And so, let's look at the persecution of the early Christians. And the 10 major persecutions began with Nero in 64 AD. This coincides with the Roman Jewish Wars of 66 to 73 AD. And here, Nero blamed Christians for Rome's fire. Successful emperors Domitian, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Decius, Valerian, and others enforced harsh policies. The most severe, under Diocletian, 303 to 311 AD, saw widespread imprisonment and executions, shaping the early church's resilience and identity. Now, one thing I did not put into here, but it is commonplace that part of this persecution also meant that there was a rise in false apostles. Ignatius, Irenaeus, all of them attest to the reality in their epistles and their writings that false teachers had also arisen up within early Christianity. Now, when we look at this and we understand this, we see Christianity's rise in the Roman Empire. And so it is not my intention at this time to detail the steps by which this advantageous concession was won. What I want to do is merely survey the changes that the church underwent in its relationship to the empire and the other religions within it. In spite of the persecution, Christianity grew until, in the 2nd century, Its adherents could be found from the Atlantic to beyond the Caspian Sea, from the region north of the Black Sea southward into Upper Egypt, and from Britain and France southward to the Sahara in Africa. No one knows how many people were there. Nobody knows how many people there were who professed membership. If there were any records kept, they are not available to our time and understanding. Now, there have been some Catholic writers in the Middle Ages where they've attempted to prove that 10% or more of the total population was Christian. However, when we look at Gibbon, after carefully scrutinizing the sources which are available, he concluded that the Christians around about 300 AD numbered not more than 1/20th or 5% of the empire's population. However, this 5% is very important, and sooner or later they would have to be dealt with in some other fashion than that of extermination, which had failed for more than 2 centuries. See, Christianity was becoming sufficiently strong in the 3rd century, where governmental authorities began to consider making a change in attitude toward them. Consider Gallienus, emperor from 260 to 268. He was one of the emperors who made the first direct move to change the Christian position. Under his father Valerian, 253 to 260, the Christians had been deprived of practically all civil rights, and many had been executed. Gallienus issued edicts making it unlawful to molest Christians, allowed bishops to sue to recover Christian cemeteries, and allowed the Christian church to become a corporation entitled to hold property. These concessions made Christianity a religio licita, or a legal religion. This good fortune was of short duration, and later emperors recalled these benefits. With the publication of the Edict of Toleration at Milan in 313 AD, it had been preceded by an edict that made concessions to the Christians by Galerius in 311 AD. It is here that Christianity found itself a tolerated religion. Now, when we look at this, Christianity went from a religion of toleration to official recognition within the Roman Empire, within the Roman state and republic. Once the barrier had been passed, the Christian movement took a direction toward an apostate condition, which had never been thought of by the early church leaders. But in the intervening centuries, some theologians and Christian philosophers had thought of a condition in which Christianity would become the most powerful force within the Roman world, perhaps even supplanting the rule of the emperors. Constantine the Great, born about 274 and was emperor from 313 to 337, through various favors shown the church, moved it into a position in which it received governmental help financially, and its leaders were accorded favors from the empire. It thus acquired recognition as one of the officially accepted religions within the jurisdiction of the government. And then when it moved from toleration to favoritism, we see that under Constantine, Christianity rose from a marginalized faith to the most favored religion of the Roman Empire. His professed conversion and generous concessions elevated the church, granting privileges to clergy and removing barriers for Christians in government and the military. This favor soon advanced to official recognition, as bishops were given positions of civic responsibility and churches received financial support. The decisive turning point came in 392 AD when Emperor Theodosius proclaimed Christianity the sole religion of the empire, outlawing pagan practices, repurposing temples, and imposing penalties on those who resisted. Yet with this triumph came a troubling reversal. The once persecuted church became a persecutor itself. Pagan cults were driven underground, while dissenting Christian sects, such as the Donatists and the Marcionites, faced harsh suppression. The ethic of love and tolerance that had marked the early church gave way to coercion, as leaders argued that conformity to true Christianity was more important than freedom. In time, this compulsion extended to the denial of property, liberty, and even life itself. Imperial Christianity, bound tightly to political power, drifted from the gospel ideal of love and moved toward a legacy of force and control. And this is where we get into the rise of the imperial Christian era under the Roman Empire and beyond. And so as we look at this, Christianity began as an illicit sect within the Roman Empire. denied legal recognition, and often persecuted for refusing to participate in civic religion. And the imperial cult, well, Roman officials viewed Christian exclusivity as a threat to unity, leading to repeated waves of suppression and accusations of atheism. Despite this hostility, the faith spread across the empire. And by the 3rd century, its growing presence forced emperors to reconsider. Gallienus granted concessions, and the Edict of Milan in 313 legalized Christianity, marking a turning point. Under Constantine, the church gained imperial favor, financial support, and civic influence, becoming the most favored religion. This culminated in 392 AD when Theodosius declared Christianity the sole religion of the empire, outlawing paganism and repurposing temples. Yet with triumph came compromise. The once persecuted church became a persecutor, suppressing pagan cults and rival Christian sects, and shifting from its early ethic of love to coercion and political power. This transformation illustrates both the ascent and the apostasy of imperial Christianity, setting the stage for the restoration narrative that sought to recover the original purity of Christ's church. And so here you can see the sources that I have here that I relied on. Like I said, this is in the PDF document that you can download. It is available for free, and this provides some information for further research that you can look into. And if you have any questions, go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comment section and share this. Give this a like and subscribe. And until next time, continue to grow in faith, continue to grow in understanding, as we all are pressing forward with steadfast faith through Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name, amen.